Hi everyone! So in this video we're going to get into ecosystems, and that's going to include both living and non-living things. So we're going to explore producers, consumers, decomposers, and even going through like the food chains of the producers, consumers, and decomposers, and also the energy pyramid of the consumers. So let's get into it. So when we look at these three pictures, you might not think that a desert, a lake, and a rainforest have much in common. But let's take a closer look. When we look at the desert, we see that they have camels, there's a bunch of sand everywhere, and there's a couple like little pieces of grass and greenery here and there. When we look at the lake, we see that there is first a huge body of water, and surrounding that there are a bunch of trees and shrubs and grass. And we can assume that there's probably some animals wandering around or flying around in the forests, and there's probably so many fish and other aquatic life living in the lake. Finally, we look at the forest, and we see a gorilla surrounded by leaves and trees and walking on mulch. So these three things might seem like they have completely different animals and completely different temperatures and all of these different aspects to them, but they do have something in common. These environments are all called ecosystems. An ecosystem is basically a place or an environment or surrounding that has both living and non-living things that interact with each other. For instance, let's look at the desert. The desert has living things, such as the camels and the grass, and non-living things, such as the temperature of the desert or the little shrubs of grass that you see. In the lake, there are obviously lots of living things, like the trees and shrubs, the animals that we know are probably living around the lake or inside of the lake. But there's also non-living things like the water or the rocks or the mountains in the background. And finally, we see the forest. There's living things like the gorilla and the trees and the leaves. But there's non-living things like, again, the twigs on the ground and the rocks and mulch he's walking on. So again, an ecosystem has living and non-living things, and there's actually words that scientists use to describe living and non-living things. A living thing, for instance, is called a biotic factor. Biotic basically means it has life. On the other hand, a non-living thing is called abiotic, and it means that it does not have life. So again, an ecosystem needs to have both of these things, and they interact with each other in order to survive. Okay, so we all know that what living and non-living things are, right? So, for instance, a dog is a living thing. A chair is not a living thing. A plant is a living thing, but a rock is not a living thing. But when we talk about living things, there are multiple groups we can put them in. The three main groups are producers, consumers, and decomposers. So what is a producer? An example of a producer is a plant. Have you ever seen a plant eating an animal or other plants for food? Probably not. Well, all living things need to get their energy from somewhere, so where do plants get their energy? Well, think when you grow a plant from a seed. You're out gardening, and you need to make sure that you garden it somewhere where it's going to get a bunch of sunlight, and you also need to water every day. Well, the sun is actually where the plant makes its own food. It does not need a stove or a kitchen like we do, but all it needs is itself. If we zoom into a plant and find the cells that make up the plant, inside the cells we see tiny little structures called chlorophyll. The chlorophyll makes up a structure or a substance called chloroplast. These do two things for the plants. One, the chloroplast actually gives the color green to the plant. And second, the chlorophyll, which is the substance that makes the chloroplast, allows the plant to actually perform photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is basically where the plant is able to make its own food using the sunlight and water and air. So this is why plants are actually called producers, because they're producing or making their own food. So let's take a closer look at photosynthesis, or the process that plants use to make their own food. So how is a plant able to make its own food using the tiny things of chlorophyll? Well, it's kind of like shopping, but in a scientific way. When your parents go shopping, if you want to get something, you have to pay for it. So you're essentially taking something, but you have to give something for that to happen. So you have to give money in order to get like a candy bar. So during photosynthesis, the plant takes in sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is found in the air. And it uses this to make its own food. But when it takes these things, it has to release oxygen that we breathe and sugars into the environment for other animals or other plants to use. So basically, like I was saying, this photosynthesis is kind of like shopping, because the plants kind of take what they need, like the sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide, like you might buy a candy from the store, but then you have to give money for that candy, just like the plant has to give up a sugar such as glucose and oxygen to the environment. So here's a scientific equation to show us that plants are taking in carbon dioxide, which again is found in the air, and we actually, when you exhale, you give out carbon dioxide. They also need water, and they need sunlight. And then they also give out, after photosynthesis, they give out glucose, which is a sugar used by other plants and animals, and oxygen, which is important for us as we have to breathe oxygen. And that's why planting trees and other plants are so important, because they allow us to breathe. Okay, so we talked about producers and how they don't eat anything, but they use photosynthesis, and they use the sun for their energy and give oxygen for us to use. But now we're going into the next level of living organisms, consumers. So producers are plants, but consumers are more of the animals. So consumers get their name because they consume or eat plants and other animals. So some consumers might only eat plants, and they do not eat any animals. These animals are called herbivores. So what are some animals that eat only plants and absolutely no animals? Well, these include cows, giraffes, or deers. They're basically like a vegetarian version of animals. So these animals do not eat any animals because they're just not fit to do that. Their teeth may not be sharp enough to chew through animals, or they might not be fast enough to catch an animal to eat. Can you imagine a cow running after a sheep for its dinner? No, because it just doesn't have the energy to do so. Now, there are also animals that live off of just eating other animals. They do not eat any plants. These animals are called carnivores, so they're kind of like the opposite of herbivores, as they don't eat any plants but just animals. Their instinct and body allows them to run after slower animals like deer or fish, and they're usually predators. And their teeth and claws allow them to eat through them and get down to their bones and eat all the meat off of the other animals. So some carnivores are lions, sharks, and foxes. These are all animals, again, that just go after other animals. They chase them, they rip them apart, and use these animals as their energy source. And they eat no plants at all. The last kind of consumer is an omnivore. So this is kind of like the in-between between herbivores and carnivores. An omnivore can eat both animals and plants. So humans are kind of like omnivores, because although some people choose not to eat meat, they're still able to do so. They just choose not to. Some other examples are dogs or bears. Dogs can eat vegetables and stuff like that, but they also eat meat. Just like that, bears eat berries and other nuts, but they can also eat fish. So when we talk about herbivores, omnivores, and carnivores, they all get their energy from somewhere, and there are actually different levels we can put them in, depending on where they get their energy from. The first level is producers. Remember, these are the plants that make their own food through the sun, carbon dioxide, and water. The next level are herbivores and omnivores. These animals basically get their energy from eating other plants or animals. And this group is called primary consumers because they're the first level of consumers. The level above these are secondary consumers, which are comprised of omnivores and carnivores. So there's no herbivores in this level, and they can only eat, they either eat only animals or they eat both animals and plants. So what do all these levels mean? Well, before we ask ourselves that, what do you notice about the pyramid, the shape of the pyramid? Well, it looks like a triangle, so it's wide at the bottom and pointy and skinny at the top. So when you look at the producer section, doesn't it look a lot bigger than the first level consumer section? Well, this tells us that since this is an energy pyramid, producers have more energy in our environment than the primary consumers, and the primary consumers have more energy than the secondary consumers, and the secondary consumers have more energy than the tertiary consumers or third level consumers. So why do carnivores and the third level consumers have so much less energy than the producers? Well, what happens is that the producers are able to get as much food as they need because it's coming from the sun, the carbon dioxide in the air, and water, which is not in low supply at all. And because we can't get rid of sunlight or water or air, these are just going to keep giving the plants their energy. So these producers have the most energy and can get the most energy and make their most energy for themselves. When a first level consumer like a herbivore or omnivore eats the producers, some of the energy of the producers gets passed down to them when they eat the plants, but some of it kind of gets lost to the environment. Like as they're eating the plants, they're losing some of the energy as they eat it. So the first level consumers still have a lot of energy, but they have a little bit less than the producers. So this is why this section is kind of smaller than the producer section. Then, since the second level consumers eat either only plants or plants and animals, when they eat either the producers or first level consumers, they still get some of the energy of these organisms, but again, some of it is lost when they're actually eating some of their energy, or when for carnivores, when they have to, or omnivores, when they have to go chase after their food, and they lose some of the energy that way. So finally, we get to the tertiary consumers, or the animals that are all carnivores. And these eat either the first level or second level consumers. They don't eat any producers. And since producers have the most energy, they're not getting all of this energy, and instead they're getting animals that have less energy themselves. And like we know, when an animal eats another animal or another plant, then some of the energy they're getting from that food, it's kind of lost to the environment because they use up a little bit of the energy while they're chewing the food. So one way you can think of this pyramid is relating it to human as he or she ages. So when you're a baby or a child, you have a lot of energy. But as you grow, or in this instance, as you go up from the bottom to the top, the energy dies down. So while all the organisms in the energy pyramid are different, as you go up the pyramid, there is less and less energy because as organisms eat each other in the levels below it, some energy is lost to the environment. Now we have finished talking about producers, which are plants, and they make their energy through the sun, water, and the air. And we've talked about consumers and how there's 3 types, and they're each grouped upon where they get their energy from. But now we're going to finish up with the last section of living organisms that we see in ecosystems, which are decomposers. So have you ever seen that when an animal dies, there are first flies and insects that surround it, but later a mushroom may be left in its place or may be growing on top of the dead animal? Well, this is a decomposer at work. Decomposers are in charge of breaking down dead animals and taking the nutrients from their body, all the minerals and all the stuff that made up the animal, and breaking it down into small little pieces and putting it back into the soil. So thanks to decomposers, we don't see a bunch of dead animals on the grass or a forest after they die. All we see are some mushrooms, bacteria, or even insects taking care of the mess. And the nutrients that they put back into the soil is actually used by producers, and the nutrients in the soil actually helps them grow stronger and better, and this way the whole cycle of the producers and the consumers and decomposers, all of this continues to go and cycle on. Okay, so now we have finished talking. Okay, so we talked about the different animals and where they get their energy from, and all the living things in an ecosystem. And we can actually represent all these interactions in something called food chains. So a food chain is basically like a line showing what animals or where plants get their energy from. So for instance, we see here that the producer gets its energy from the water, the sun, and also the air, which is not pictured. Then we see a primary consumer, or a consumer that's a herbivore or an omnivore, gets its food from the producers, or the plants, because the arrow is pointing towards them. Next, we see a secondary consumer gets its energy from the cricket. So the mouse is eating the cricket. And this continues on until the last animal, the tertiary consumer, and all of these animals will eventually die, and then the decomposers will take care of it, and it will go back. The nutrients will go back into the producers, who will use this, and the cycle will keep continuing. So basically in this food chain we see what specific animals, like the mouse eating the cricket or the hawk eating the snake, these specific animals and what they ate to get their energy and stay alive. So that was it for this video. Okay. So that was it for this video. I hope you guys learned a lot about different animals and plants and how they do photosynthesis and all about ecosystems. And if you have any questions, then leave them in the comments below. And please subscribe to this channel, as this is also part of the organization One World, One Nation, which is a nonprofit. And you can also check out the website and all of that stuff for our organization. Thank you.